Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to another edition of the Botany Bistro, where we have bite-sized botany for you. Today is going to be a lot of fun. This is our 9th session, so I'm really excited about what we're talking about today. We're going to continue our conversation about plant taxonomy and systematics. We're going to talk about the evolution of plants and some of the major groups of plants that we have. And at the end, be sure to stick around because I will be telling you some of the secrets for you to be able to tell the difference between some of the major groups of houseplants that you might have. So make sure you'll stay and hear that so that you can show off to all your friends. But first, let me just introduce myself. My name is Mary Dudley. I am the Ecology Education Manager at the Civic Garden Center in Cincinnati, Ohio. We have been on this property since 1942, and we hope to continue our work of educating people about gardening, conservation, and education through many of our programs, including our community garden program, our school programming, and our volunteer commitments. So please come and see us if you're in Cincinnati. It's starting to turn into fall. We only have a couple more days of summer to go, and so you'll see that the beautiful redbud behind me is turning different shades in the leaves. Some of our previous sessions have described why that change happens and what is going on in plant cells. So if you need a little bit of catch up, you can catch up on anatomy, morphology, basic botany, and we'll review a little bit of last week so that you're ready for our part 2 of taxonomy and systematics today. I started this program. It's free so that I can start to convey information to people that I think has been very helpful to me in my career. And I am happy to archive these sessions, so you can find us on YouTube, and you can also find us at the Civic Garden Center website. So let's go forth into the world of plant systematics and taxonomy. I don't necessarily think that when I was taking these courses in college that they were things that I was passionate about. Naming and classification can sometimes be a little bit flat, but when you really start to dig into it, there's some really exciting things happening, and it's complicated, and it includes the need for people to be able to look at big picture, but also get down to detail. So if I had to do it all over again, I think I'd pay a little bit more attention in those undergrad and graduate classes, but I'm really happy for the opportunity to dig in with you today. So we're going to be talking about classifications, significant families, and then I want to just look ahead. On October 6th, we're going to start our plant physiology unit, and that's going to be talking about the actual chemical processes that's happening inside plants, including photosynthesis. And so we'll be deep diving into that on the 6th at noon, so be sure to mark your calendars there. At the end of our session today, I will turn on the chat, so you will be welcome to ask any questions that you might have, but I always welcome an email as well. You can contact me through the Civic Garden Center. And so our lunch today, I hope you're all enjoying lunch, but our lunch today is pizza. I'm so excited about my little cheese pizza. It's going to be wonderful. I chose pizza because of the shape of the phylogenetic trees that we're going to discuss, the cladograms we're going to discuss today. And so for me, the imagery is like a piece of pizza with extra crusts kind of hanging out in the box. So if you've got like 3 or 4 pieces that you've already had or shared with friends or family, and then you've got that one piece left, that's kind of a loose cladogram. So that'll be a fun image for us, and I hope that we can enjoy our lunches together. Your homework for this week is going to take a picture of a non-vascular plant. Ooh, so we'll get into those terms soon, and share it on social media. Feel free to tag us on Facebook as well. So just so we can review what we discussed last time, we were talking about taxonomy and how plants are organized into groups. So those groups start off with larger categories and then get more specific. So we discussed the species name of a plant includes the genus and the specific epithet together. And then we also talked a little bit about the importance of plant families. Now, in addition to that, there are domains and kingdoms, orders, classes, phylum. And so if you want a review on that, please be sure to watch the previous episode. But we're going to think about the specific species that we enjoy in our lives and understand that the genus and specific epithet name that together create the species name didn't just come out of thin air. It takes a lot of planning and consensus in the scientific community around some of these things, which is not always the case. So we'll discuss that as well. But just to make sure we're on our definitions, plant systematics is a science that encompasses some aspects of traditional taxonomy, but it is also concerned with reconstructing the evolutionary history of plant life. And so thinking about how these plants are connected to each other. For a long time, this was done through plant morphology, which is the observation of plants and their external parts. Now with the development of microscopy tools and DNA sampling, we're able to get a different picture of plants than we've had before. And so things have been changing in the taxonomic world, even since I was in school. And so it's really been an interesting journey to look these up and try to get some solid numbers on how many phyla are there, how many genus and species are there in certain family groups. And I was really, really struggling. Usually I'm pretty well versed in my Google searches, and I'm pretty successful finding what I need to find. However, I was just finding different numbers all over the place. I didn't have consistency in these numbers. And so I ended up emailing Dr. Gladish, who was on the show a few weeks ago, and he told me in no uncertain terms that I was on a fool's errand, direct quote. And he said there's just a lot of different groups that are studying these different organisms, and there are some very staunch set scientists that say no, it's this way, and they're not willing to kind of compromise on some of those aspects, and same for others. So he's told me that he's been to some conferences that have gone pretty far verbally, if not a little physical. So I've never been in a situation where a bunch of scientists were that ingrained and passionate, but maybe I'll head out to one of those systematics conferences and see what it's all about. So it is a very interesting field with a lot of different ways that you can get involved. If these things are interesting to you, please do follow that passion and see where it takes you. And so if we remember the different domains and the kingdoms that we were looking at, we think about the domain Eukarya. And so in that domain, we have Protista, fungi, Animalia, and Plantae. So the plant group is in the eukaryotic group. And so what really makes a plant a plant? How are people defining plants? So this is something that is important for us to consider as we think about our own ways of classification. And so let's just think about what defines a plant specifically. And so plants are multicellular, which means they have more than one cell. There are no single-celled plants. There can be single-celled bacteria, but there are no single-cell plants. Plants are photosynthetic. So that is the process by which plants capture energy from the sunlight, use carbon dioxide from the air or the water to make their food. And they have these chloroplasts, organelles, that are found within cells. And so that's an important aspect. They also have cell walls. You'll know if you're looking at a plant cell versus an animal cell because they have these rigid walls. And they're very easily defined, so that's a good characteristic for plants. They also have a cuticle, which is a waxy layer that covers plants to keep water inside. So thinking about those particular pieces for the definition of plants, and then we work our way into thinking about plants that are more simple and more complex. Reproduction among plants is a defining characteristic of how we start to break some of these groups out from each other, and just the sophistication of that reproductive system. So there are 4 main kind of phyla groups that we're going to discuss today. Again, this was where I was like, well, how many are there total? And I could not get a solid answer. Are there 17? Are there 12? Some of them are only represented by fossil species. We'll talk more about that in our paleobotany sections coming up in the next few months. But we're going to talk about these main 4. So that for sure is not in contention. We definitely have these. And so the first ones are these bryophytes. Bryophytes are non-vascular, which meaning that they don't have the xylem and the phloem that we've discussed earlier in other plants in order to transport nutrients, water, and food. And so examples of bryophytes include mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. And so mosses can be very diverse in their makeup, in their shape, in their structure, but they do need to have moisture around so that they can move things around in their structure. So it's important that they have access to this water. They can dry up and dehydrate and still be kind of dormant. And so they don't have to have water all the time to survive necessarily, but in order to reproduce and move things around, nutrients around, they do need to have access to water. They do say sometimes that if you're in the woods, you can find your way by checking the side of the tree the moss is growing on. They'll say moss grows on the north side of trees. And if you think about that, that's because that part of the tree is the last one to get the light on it and stays cooler and moister throughout the day. So that is not always true, though. If you were lost in the woods, sometimes moss will grow around the tree in lots of directions, especially if that tree has another tree shading it. So it's a good maybe start, but don't use it as your only compass. The next one is pteridophytes, pterophytes, and so these are plants that have vascular tissue but do not have seeds. And so this is spelled Pteridophytes. And so we commonly call this group the fern group, but it does also include club mosses and horsetails. They have full-size roots and leaves, but they don't have flowers or cones. They produce spores, and that is how they reproduce. Typically on a fern, you can turn a leaf over, and if it's in its reproductive cycle, you'll see little spots on the bottom of that leaf. Sometimes they are brown or tan, and you're able to see that those are the spores. And if you put those in a wet paper towel, damp paper towel for a few days, there's a possibility that you could grow new ferns that way. So give that a try sometime. But that's an important group. Next, we have the gymnosperms. These are vascular plants that have seeds but do not flower. So gymnosperm means naked seed, and so they're not enclosed seeds like we would see in our typical fruits. And so these are examples of, our evergreens, redwoods, firs, cypress trees. They have cones and needles typically. But it's a neat group of plants that can really adapt to so many different environments. Some of the oldest living plant species on our planet are gymnosperms. And then the fourth group is the angiosperms. And these are vascular plants that have seeds and flowers. So they're able to have a strong vascular system that can help them grow big, like our big oaks or maple trees. And then they also have those beautiful flowers that we love. magnolias, lilies, and they produce a lot of fruits that we use agriculturally. So tomatoes, for example. These are all angiosperms. We've studied lots and lots of angiosperms as the human population is growing and is more attracted to these plants. Not to say that we shouldn't pay a lot of attention to the bryophytes and the pterophytes, but it's really neat to see just the different changes that we can make in an angiosperm by doing selective breeding or pollination. And so we've really enjoyed working with that group of plants as a species ourselves. So I'm going to go into a little bit more about some specific plants from these groups, and then we will talk about that secret little tidbit at the end that I'm going to give you so that you can go around and identify your friends or your own houseplants. And so I chose to eat pizza today because, first of all, pizza's awesome. Everybody loves pizza. But cladograms are a type of diagram that scientists will use to describe some of these evolutionary relationships between plants. And so they will have an initial branch that will come up, and it's represented by a common ancestor. So for our land plants, the common ancestor is green algae. Algae that was first starting to photosynthesize, still has waxy cuticle. It's able to synthesize its own glucose from the sun and air. And so that is an important thought. And then our land plants came about 475 million years ago, give or take a few. And so those land plants are starting to be able to be independent of the waterways in which the algae was growing. So that was a really big deal. They started out as non-vascular, like those bryophytes, and still being very close to water, but then were able to develop those vascular systems that enabled them to have deep, strong roots and then strong trunks so that they could withstand some of the other climate issues and manage drought in a different way. So when we're making these different diagrams, we're thinking about these common ancestors, and then we create a branch off of that when there's a particular characteristic that shows some type of evolutionary change, a modification. And we'll talk a little bit about why these modifications happen, some of the hypotheses that people have come up with, but it's pretty clear that, as plants have evolved and taken over new ecosystems and adapted to new environments, they needed to change. Their structures, their pollination aspects, their seed dispersal techniques, these all were things that happened very slowly over time. And so if you see one of these like cladograms, you'll see that it's just several branches, and then there will be different points to where some of the ones that are more closely related will be towards the top, and then some things that are less or further related from each other will be kind of spread out as you go down the line. There are different ways that people make them, though, so sometimes they're sideways, sometimes they're upside up, but I do suggest that you take a look at it. The field of cladistics is spelled Cladistics, so you can do a little Google search later. So let's talk about those fern groups, right? And so let's talk about one of my favorites. I love ferns. No offense, ferns, they're great. But equisetum is the name of a horsetail. And so these plants are like little straws that seem to be exploding at different nodes. So they have just a small green, it looks like a segmented stem, and then they typically are growing around water. So they are vascular, but they still like to be moist. And then they have this kind of ring of just little branching, like leaflets kind of coming out of them. And they're very small, typically. They don't get very large. However, about 350 million years ago, in the Devonian era, they hit their peak, we'll say. And so some of them were towering over 30 meters or more. So if we think about the climate of that time, there was a large amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, much more than we have now. And so having carbon dioxide in the atmosphere does change the way that plants grow. A lot of times they can grow larger, there'll be less storage of nitrogen, dense storage of nitrogen, so they can grow a little bit faster and they can reach these immense sizes. And so when we see illustrations of like dinosaurs tromping around the earth, in the background you'll see large cycads, large ferns, and then sometimes these towering trees that really are represented by these little horsetail species that we can still see remnants of today. Now, it is said that most of the coal seams that we harvest in our current life are the fossils of these horsetails. So that's pretty neat. So next time you turn on your lights or charge your phone, you should thank a horsetail for that. Next, we'll talk about a gymnosperm, one of the older gymnosperms that we still have living examples of, sometimes called a living fossil, and that is a ginkgo. So we have several beautiful ginkgo trees here at the Civic Garden Center. They are going to start turning, their leaves are going to start turning yellow very soon, and they will drop their leaves. They tend to be a thick leaf, and it looks kind of like a fan. And so they also occasionally will produce berries. Now these are plants that are dioecious, so they have separate male and female plants. And so the females will produce these ginkgo berries that are not typically desirable to city planners because they smell like rotting flesh. And if you can actually get past the scent of that, I had a friend who harvested several ginkgo berries for me, was able to get the flesh off and then roast the inner part, and it was delicious. So ginkgo berries are kind of a delicacy. It's used more widely in Eastern medicine than it is here, but it's a still very neat, very ancient species. So it doesn't typically flower. It will produce these fruits. The males are planted more often, so you're more likely to find a male non-fruit producing tree. But it belongs to the order Ginkgoales, which have first appeared in the Permian time era, about 270 million years ago. And ginkgo is now the only living genus within the order. And so it's only found in the wild in China, but is cultivated around the world. So it's a really neat example of a very early gymnosperm. Then we have angiosperms. I'm not going to talk about all the angiosperms, but one of my favorite angiosperm groups is the Magnoliaceae, the plant family that includes magnolias and tulip trees. We don't have a lot of industrial or economic use for them here in the United States. Occasionally they will be used for wood, but they're mostly ornamental, and they are very lovely. So this was one of those points of contention where I was getting frustrated because if you look up even the Wikipedia page for Magnoliaceae, it's like, oh, there's 2 genera, and it's just Magnolia and Liriodendron. It's like, okay, Wikipedia. And then like 2 paragraphs later, it's like, there are 17 accepted genera in this family. I'm like, what? So apparently it's a thing, and the internet doesn't have all the answers on this. But there are generally considered to have 2 genera in this. And so these magnolias are different than a lot of our other more modern angiosperms because the flower parts are arranged around a conical receptacle. So most of our other angiosperms are going to be composed of whorls or rings of floral parts, and this one is just not. It's a little bit different. And so it's also been tied to other fossil plants, and so we think that it's a early angiosperm, one of the first ones. And so we're very happy to be able to host lots of magnolias in our garden here as well at the Civic Garden Center. And in spring, they are definitely a sight to behold when they're all blooming. It's just so lovely. The flowers also don't have differentiated parts into petals and sepals, which most angiosperms later developed. And we kind of call those tepals since they look the same as petals and sepals. But the family has a couple hundred species and ranges. Because the Magnoliaceae has been around for so long, their range has become disjuncted, just like it's been spread out. Let's just say that. It's become disjunct or fragmented is a better way for me to say that. And so that's due to ice ages, continental drift, mountain formation. But there are Magnoliaceae species in temperate and tropical Asia, the Himalayan regions, Japan, Canada, Brazil, they're all over. They've been around for a really, really long time. So I'm sure that there's things we can learn from these beautiful magnolia trees. And we're just kind of starting to understand about their evolutionary history. So let's think about why species would evolve. And this will bring us into our next part about those houseplants I keep teasing you about. So thinking about why species might evolve. So I was curious to hear one of my coworkers giving a talk yesterday, and he was standing in front of a Kentucky coffee tree and talking about how the seed of this coffee tree is very dense and hard and large. And so it's not easily dispersed by our current fauna that live in our region. And so then the idea is, why does it have a seed like that? And if we think about some of the megafauna that used to be here, really, honestly, not that long ago, to us it seems like a long time, but humans have not been here for that long. It's because we used to have mammoths, mastodons wandering into the forest, and we're easily able to manage a seed that size, consume the seed, and leave it with a pile of fertilizer later. And so that's one really important tool for plants is seed dispersal. You don't want all of your kids to grow up literally under your feet. You would like to have them move out of the house. And so plants have had to adapt in different ways to changing climates, to the access for seed dispersers, and the access to pollinators. So I was reading an interesting article about how plants that are pollinated by bumblebees, which are fairly large pollinator, have larger flowers and maybe more distinct nectar guides. Maybe spend a little bit more energy on having a scent to attract a certain pollinator. However, plants that are pollinated by like a hoverfly, they'll be totally differently shaped and will have maybe not as many nectaries, and maybe they'll have a different time when they bloom. So it's just the plants and the pollinators and the environment are all changing together. They're adapting to different things together, and that's what causes these changes over time. Some of these changes do not result in anything that is still around today. Sometimes we're seeing vestigial changes, and so some of those records are only kept in fossils. But other things we can start to monitor, and these won't happen necessarily in our lifetime. Evolution happens very slowly. But seeing how some of these species adapt is a great lesson for us as we try to mimic healthy ecosystems. And biomimicry is something that I think we really need to pay more attention to in our daily lives. So as we have talked a little bit about the bryophytes and the fern group and the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, let's think about a couple different types of evolution. So one of them is called divergent, and that is when a group of plants that seem to be closely related do not necessarily look the same. And so a lot of times this can be a change, for example, with the magnolia group. Some of these plants have very different features from each other. They have diverged in their evolution because they've been maybe separated by a mountain range. or they've had another event, climate event that they're working on, or they've lost access to a pollinator or a seed disperser. And so they've had to change how they address those issues. And then you have something called convergent evolution, which is where species that are not closely related exhibit similar features. Now, a lot of this has been more recently discovered through the use of DNA analysis, but it's a really neat story to tell. So here's your botany trick of the day. If you like succulents, and some of you might have quite a collection of succulents, there are two main groups of succulents that people tend to have in their homes. And so one of these is the cactus group, and the other one are euphorbias. And so they are not at all the same or even closely related. But to the untrained eye, you might think, oh, these are all cacti. Very rarely would I think someone from North America would think, oh, these are all euphorbs, or spurges, which is another common term for them. But they are not all cacti. So let's think about how you can tell a cacti from a euphorb or a spurge, and you'll be able to impress all of your friends. So we have these plants. They both are succulents, which when I say that, I mean they have kind of thick stems. They have evolved in a way that has enabled them to survive in arid landscapes. And so that's a very crucial adaptation, because if you're not able to store water in your stem or soak up large amounts of water when it is available, those short periods of time when you do get rains, you're not going to survive in that habitat. And so they have kind of thicker stems. Sometimes they're a little spongy, photosynthetic, typically as well. They'd be green. And then they need to protect themselves. So if you are like a big cooler in the desert and this little critter is thirsty, how are you going to hold on to your water? So you really need to have a plan for that. And so they tend to have these swollen stems, and they also have a way to protect themselves, which are thorns or spines. But they're no more closely related to each other than like dogs and cats. And while those are still mammals, I doubt many of you would confuse the two. So since you're becoming botanists, you are now going to be charged with knowing the difference between cacti and euphorbs. And so cacti have something called areoles. And so those are little discs, pretty much. They're like little dots where the where the spines are going to be coming from. All right. So you'll see them pretty distinctly once you start to look for them. This is also the point of origin for flowers, typically, or any kind of branching that happens on a cactus. And so those are going to be really concentrated. And so you'll see these little kind of dots happening. The Euphorbiaceae do not have these. And no other plant has these. So if you look closely at them and you don't see any of these little kind of small round areas where you have a concentration of spines, which are modified leaves or flowers, then you probably are looking at a euphorbs. Also, euphorbs tend to bear a single or a paired thorn, which can be modified stems as well, if they have thorns at all. And so they're usually thick and clearly part of the stem. Like it would be hard to break that off without hurting the plant. With a cacti, you can kind of pull on a lot of these spines and they'll come out. I was weeding my sister's plant pots in Tucson and got terrible case of these tiny little spines that I couldn't even see in my hands for days because they were almost jumping out. They were ready to leave the cacti and jump right into my skin and say, hey, no, stay away. I don't want you over here. And so those are a little bit different. And so you'll be able to see that as well. And then cacti spines, like I said, are modified leaves rather than thorns. And they typically will form a circle, and they'll be kind of centered in that circle. So make sure that you're looking at those little pieces. There's a couple of other ways that you can tell as well. Euphorbias tend to produce a milky sap if they are wounded. It's like a sticky kind of latex, so it's usually white in color. And that's another protection for them, because animals don't want to be eating latex unless you're a monarch caterpillar, and then you're doing it so that you're not readily eaten by other things. And so that's another area of protection in addition to the spines that they have, the thorns that they have, excuse me. And then the last just kind of fun thing to remember is that cacti evolved in the New World and are found in North, South, and Central America, as well as the Caribbean. Only one species is native to Old World. When we say Old World, we think of Africa, Madagascar, and drier areas of Asia. And that is where the euphorbs come from. So they are just one genus in the family Euphorbiaceae, like I said, also called spurges. But it's really interesting to think that thousands of miles away from each other, both of these plants were handling similar conditions, similar challenges, and they adapted to those challenges with the same similar techniques, and they're now easy for you to tell apart. But for many people, they just look at them, oh yes, of course, they're all succulents. They must all be related. They're all cousins. But really, there are some major differences between cacti and Euphorbiaceae. So that is kind of our little lesson today about botany. I want you to think about this information in a way that will help us predict future changes. It's really neat to have citizen scientists out there that are recording changes, bloom times, pollinator visits, existence of new species that may come up in an area that you frequent. And so please do take those notes, share those with your community, and we'll all just keep botanizing together. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on the chat, and we'll have a little lunch. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer those.